So our today's topic is education. Why and how is the system changing? And we all can recognize that as parents or teachers or citizens, education is a key topic in our lives and one of the major levers for society's evolution, and also for its ability to face changes and challenges. But it's also true that all across the globe, we hear people talking about the changes that education systems need to bring forward in order to cope with this uncertain, ever-changing and complex world we live in. Big words, big concepts, and maybe because of that, they're really hard to make them clear and usable in order to understand the reason why, the what to do and how to deal with it. This talk aims to bring some light on this sometimes fuzzy and obscure topic by giving some insights on what we're really talking about, but also trying to inspire schools, parents and parents, school parents and, citizens with some disruptive and effective examples of what is happening in the world regarding this subject. Our guest today is one of the most qualified persons I know to talk about this topic. And that's why, of course, we invited him to be here today with us. Please make the most out of this 1 hour and don't hesitate to leave your questions, anxieties, and ideas here so we can all make the most out of it. Ross, thank you so much for being here. I will still have to introduce you, but this is the first moment I take out of many I will have during the talk to thank you for being here with us. We always start our talks by introducing our guests. So I remember that back in 2016, when I first started working with Ashoka's Changemakers Schools program in Portugal, I had a European gathering in Barcelona where I first met Ross. And looking back and thinking about it, I remember being impressed about two particular reasons. First, Ross was really tall, but tall enough, for me to have to look up on him. I mean, I'm really short, so Ross is really tall, so I had to really look up on him. Second, after I heard him talking about education and how education systems could change, I remember thinking that, one, I still had to look up on him because he had so much knowledge and depth in his thoughts that I clearly felt that I had a lot to learn from him. And second, and two, that he had this guttural voice that calmed me. You will see it in a moment. He has a strong voice. Everything looked easier and peaceful when he talked. That was a heck of a first impression, I must tell you, Russ. And you know what they say, first impressions are everything. Since then, I have been trying to keep up really with his path and struggling to get the most out of it. After that, he and Andreas Schleicher from OCDE were looking for a spot to pilot a new and innovative community learning project in Europe. And I suggested Portugal as a possibility. We started working on this together with João Costa, who was then Secretary of State for Education in Portugal, and who, by the way, was our guest on our last Friday talk on the 26th of June. And more recently, Ross challenged me to be part of a movement of global education leaders called LearnLife.com, which I immediately accepted because the invitation came from him, of course. And trust is something that you build on with time and with objective references. And he's definitely a strong reference for me. Ross is co-founder of the Weaving Lab, a global community who is aiming to grow the field of weaving learning ecosystems in which everyone learns to thrive together. Ross also works as a weaver with Round Glass, weaving a global community of change leaders who are working to shift education systems so that everyone learns to live for universal well-being. Ross incubated the Weaving Lab while leading Ashoka's global education strategy for 5 years. That was when I had the chance to meet him. Before that, he designed the Learn a Guide and Better World programs with ComFed, empowering 500,000 people across Zimbabwe and Tanzania to be well and do well. This extended the Effective Education for Employment project that he conceived while with Pearson, using it to evaluate the effectiveness of education systems internationally. Before joining Pearson, Ross spent 15 years designing and launching 20 businesses on 5 continents. One of his most used and inspiring sentences is one from Alan Watts, and I quote it, "We are this universe, and we are creating it at every moment." And this is the moment that we are creating now, and let's just hope that it can transform someone, because piece by piece the puzzle will be visible for more and more people, and then real change can happen. Ross, we always start these talks with some icebreaker questions, and you will be no exception, okay? These questions are a bit provocative and a test to your sense of humor, but, you know, I know you have one, so I'm comfortable with that. So if you are, I will drop the first question, okay?
Let's go for it.
Are you ready?
Yeah. Well, first of all, much to my mother's pleasure, I wasn't this tall when I was born. So that's the first answer to that question. And actually, it's interesting, although I think I may have a soothing voice, I think that belies the anxiety that I feel inside. I don't feel as calm as I may sound. And in fact, I have moments of high anxiety. And certainly in my childhood, you know, I was thinking back, Fred, before coming on this, actually, I was having a conversation with an old friend of mine, and we were reflecting on our school experience together. And it was a horrible school experience. But the school I went to in 1970s in the northeast of England, which was a very kind of economically deprived time for that part of the UK, was all about punk rock and football hooliganism and miners striking. It was Thatcherism. It was a very kind of violent and ugly time to be in school. And I think in many ways that's really shaped my views on school, and particularly, you know, I feel as I've got this rather brutal experience that I really wouldn't want to wish on anybody. Yeah, well, it certainly wasn't an epiphany, but my dad was a teacher, and he was also a scoutmaster, and his whole philosophy, I mean, he was a maths teacher, but actually his philosophy really was what we would now call character education and civic participation. I mean, he dedicated his life to helping other people. And he's had a really profound influence on me. It's interesting, as I get older, the more I realize that he has had this and continues to have this profound influence. And I remember being in town in Newcastle upon Tyne, and quite often people stopping him in the street and saying, "Oh, Mr. Hall, thanks. I just want to thank you for, you know, giving me a chance, changing my life," and that. So that I had a very that idea of character development, whole person development, and civic participation was really rammed home for me from a very early age. But then on top of that, my school experience, as I say, was really unhappy. And that continued into university when I did a really kind of Mickey Mouse degree at university, which had no particular substance to it, wasn't really useful in terms of finding a job, wasn't fulfilling. I mean, it really failed on many counts. So I usually think of myself as being really lucky that I had a strong learning environment at home, and then such a kind of terrible and unhappy learning experience in the education system. I think that's really shaped my perspective. So having graduated from university, I really had no idea what to do. I was quite lost, I think, in many ways. But on the basis that I seemingly was unqualified to do any meaningful work, I thought I'd better do another qualification. So I took a qualification in finance, which I hated, absolutely hated. But still, it did get me work, which was helpful. And that got me into business. And it sort of, I never planned this, but I was thrown into opportunities in business to help design and launch new businesses. So I'd been quite creative from very early days. I would sort of have quite an inquisitive and creative mind. And I really enjoyed in that role in business the creativity, that idea of you literally, from a piece of paper, you create a business plan, and then you secure money and you build a team and you create product and you actually bring something to life. It was very satisfying, very kind of high adrenaline, intense work. And I did that. I was lucky enough to do that for many years in different countries. But what was really bothering me in that work was this relentless pursuit of money at all costs. There was never, it felt soulless to me and pointless. And in fact, in many cases, it felt really devastating. I remember a meeting, I was working with a big pharmaceutical company, and I remember a board meeting, and this is slightly exaggerated for effect, but essentially it was a board meeting where there was a big problem with profitability in Africa. And someone piped up and they said, I think I've got the answer to this. There's a new drug that we could introduce to Africa, and it's fantastic for two reasons. First of all, it's 80% margins, and everyone said, "Oh, this is great, we're going to make lots of money." But secondly, once someone's on it, they're probably going to stay on that drug for 3 years or more because it's an antidepressant. So it was this idea of a big corporate, here's just one anecdote really, but a big corporate seeing this opportunity to make money, I think probably at the expense of at least personal and probably social well-being. And I had a lot of these kinds of experience where I just felt this isn't feeling right to me. But then I got the opportunity to work with Pearson, the education giant. And again, that was an interesting experience. It was interesting insofar as I got, again, very frustrated because it seemed to me that this big corporation was perpetuating a broken system by, pushing standardized assessments, pushing textbooks, pushing curricula, etc. Even though it sort of wanted to do something different, I felt that it was struggling to do anything meaningfully different. But what was much more interesting for me was that I had the opportunity to travel the world with Pearson, visiting schools, talking to kids and teachers and parents and policymakers and business people, and kind of looking very closely at education systems. And what struck me there was that education systems are just not designed to create a better world. And during these travels, what came home to me very strongly was there's a desperate need to create a better world. I was coming face to face with poverty and inequity and extremism and forced migration. And it struck me that I started getting increasingly obsessed with the problems that we're facing in the world, the need to address these problems face on, and therefore the need to transform education as one of the ways in which, one of the prerequisites, I suppose, to transforming the world and creating a better world. I think first of all, I don't think companies have changed enough. You know, there's an increasing movement of companies who are going way beyond CSR. You know, the promise of corporate social responsibility was that this would be companies really making a major contribution to improving quality of life or making a better world, or whatever term you want to use for that. And you've now got B Corps, and you've got you know, triple bottom line reporting, and you've got a lot of sort of interesting initiatives that companies are taking, and some super companies. And even in the past months, I think we're starting to see companies moving into circular economies. You know, you've got people like Patagonia, H&M making very bold statements about becoming 100% circular, etc. So you've definitely got positive movements in regard to companies. But for most companies still, the ultimate purpose is perpetual economic growth. And we know that that is not sustainable. We know that not only is that not sustainable, but it's a massive problem in terms of social, personal, and environmental well-being. So I don't think companies have changed enough, and we desperately need companies to step up and take the lead and change. And to link to that second question then is, so what does it mean? You know, what kind of company, what can anyone do to create a better world? And I think in some ways that idea of a better world is perhaps always going to be subjective to some extent, although there are objective measures that are really important. And the way I think of a better world is, I think it's helpful to think of it crudely in three layers, almost concentric circles. So at the core is the idea of personal well-being. So my own, how well am I, which would involve how well am I physically, how well am I emotionally, how well am I mentally, how well are my relationships, so relationally, how well am I spiritually? And within that construct of the five, what I would call 5 dimensions of personal well-being, you can address all sorts of basic human needs: the need for belonging, the need for play, the need for love and care, the need for security, safety, calm, etc. So it's a complex idea, but I think, you know, these are things which are both subjective and objective. We can measure much of this idea of personal well-being. So that's at the core of this idea of a better world, this idea of personal well-being. Now, sitting outside that is the idea of social well-being. So this would relate to how well is our society, you know, to what extent do we trust each other? What's the quality of our relationships? Do we have access to education? Do we have access to healthcare? Do we have access to food supply chains, etc., etc.? So there's again, a measurable set of things that sit in that second row. On the outer circle is how well is the planet beyond our species? How well is the food that we eat? How well is the food that the food we eat eats? How well is the soil, the air, the water, the biosphere? At the moment, we know that there are huge problems there. And by the way, on that subject, you know, climate change is a massive problem, but it looks like a very small problem compared to the problem of biodiversity loss, which is a very real existential problem for our species and for many other species. We are destroying the planet, and all of that comes down to the way we farm, which again connects to industry. So the industrialization of farming and food supply chains and food, including food production and food transportation and retail and consumption, this is a huge problem that we're now facing. So in this idea of a better world, I think it's useful to think of personal, societal, and planetary well-being, something I would call universal well-being. And the shorthand for that is the idea of thriving. I think if we think of ourselves as thriving, we immediately can imagine the idea of us thriving individually, as a species, and as a whole planet. And I think that's absolutely got to be the shared purpose for every business, for every government, and for every education system. Yeah, that's a great question, Fred. I like that idea of leading with questions. I think to answer that question, let me just, if I may, just take a step from that idea of universal well-being into education. I think there's an important piece in the middle, which I think might be important to an answer to your question. So if you think about the idea of us thriving, I think there's a central idea that sits underneath that idea of thriving, and that is, and it comes back to the quote that I gave, that you read out right at the beginning. So Alan Watts says, we are this universe and we are creating it at every moment. And it's that phrase is said in many different ways, in many different spiritual practices. And essentially means, we are all completely interconnected. And that interconnection or interdependence means that my well-being is inextricably entwined with your well-being, and with our well-being, and the well-being of everything else. Which is why when we talk about thriving, we need to talk about thriving together. It makes no sense to say that I'm thriving if you're not thriving. I think it was Donella Meadows said something like, a healthy cell must live in a healthy organ, which must live in a healthy body, in a healthy family, in a healthy community, in a healthy species, on a healthy planet.
It's so the matryoshka, kind of
exactly
thinking, yeah.
Exactly. So if we accept that, what we must also accept, I think, is that it's through our every action at every moment that we're shaping the world, that we are defining the extent to which we're thriving or not thriving. So we therefore need to really pay attention to the choices and actions that we make at every moment. And it's that idea of living for universal well-being, or living to thrive together, choosing and acting from moment to moment to thrive together, which is central, I think, to our chances of making a better world. Now, if we accept that, so I've done thousands of interviews with people around the world for 15 years or more, and I usually ask the same sorts of questions, which is, what does it mean if you think about living for universal well-being, choosing and acting from moment to moment for your own well-being and the well-being of our species and the planet? What does that involve? And you get the same answers from people everywhere, from the economically poorest villages in Africa to the economically wealthiest places in Manhattan or wherever. People will always say, well, they'll think a bit and then they'll say, well, it certainly involves being empathic, and it involves being self-aware and being self-regulated and being thoughtful and being kind and generous and being curious and being imaginative and being creative. And they'll go on, and you usually get about 50 answers from any group of people, and they're pretty much always the same. What's really interesting is there's a strong emphasis on being. It's being empathic and being self-aware and being wise, etc. So it's clear that to live for universal well-being means we need to enhance people's being in the world. It's a way of being in the world. It's not just what you do, in other words, it's the way you do it. It's the way you are in the world. And if it's about being a certain way in the world, then it's about becoming. It's about becoming empathic, becoming self-aware, becoming creative and curious. And so I think there's a really important point in this, which is that learning needs to be liberated from the idea of just being about acquiring knowledge. Learning is not just about acquiring knowledge, nor is it just about developing skills. It's equally about becoming a certain kind of human being who is living for universal well-being. Now, by liberating the idea of learning, you can then very quickly start to get into the conversation. So how do you become this kind of person? Through what kind of experience can we become this kind of person? If you accept that genes contribute maybe 50% of who you are, and that learning contributes the other 50%, you've got to ask the question, how do we learn? How do we become to be this kind of human being? Now, again, when I ask this question everywhere, you get the same answers everywhere. People will say, well, how did I become this kind of human being? They'll say, well, from an early age, I took the lead. So young people taking the lead from a very early age. And that's the other thing. People will always say it starts from birth. And in fact, it starts from -9 months, of course, and it continues till 999.
You told that. I saw a talk you gave with Ashoka in 2018 in France, where you told exactly that sentence, which was development starts.
Speech, by the way, Fred, of course.
Sorry?
I'm just repeating the same speech, by the way.
No, but I was really curious about what you meant with that, and how do you conciliate that with, the sentence that you just said before, that maybe 50% comes from our genes, and then the other 50%. What's the relation?
Yeah, well, we all have predispositions. If you think about weightlifting, some people will never be able to lift really heavy weights. And some people will be able to lift really heavy weights if they train. But everyone can train and they can reach their limits. So everyone has a kind of a range of capacity to become more or less empathic, more or less creative, more or less whatever these qualities or powers may be. So I think it's reasonable to assume that we all have limits to our own development, and that the development of ourselves in these many dimensions starts inside the mother, because it's influenced by nutrition, for example. We are developing from the point of conception throughout our lives, and this is the whole human development, in other words. So the experience that you have inside your mother is surely deeply important in our development, and it continues from birth and throughout life. And what's really interesting is when you ask people what are the experiences that are most important in helping someone become the kind of person who lives for universal well-being, they will say it's young people taking the lead from an early age. It's young people getting out into the community and doing and learning in the community and with the community. It's often young people learning with people of different ages. So intergenerational learning comes out very strongly always. It's learning in nature. It's often really convening deeply with nature. It's learning through experimentation and inquiry and failing. It's learning through moving and making and meditating. And people list, again, the same kinds of things. Now, what's particularly startling about this list of things that everyone lists is that you don't find these things in school experiences. It's almost like a description of everything that school isn't. And I think this is really critical. So if you come back to your question, first of all, I think it's really important to recognize that the purpose of school is not really to empower people to create a better world. That's not what schools were designed for. Pardon me. Schools were essentially, there are varying histories of schooling, but essentially, you know, out of the Renaissance, when there was an emphasis on kind of scientific thinking and reasoning, being rational, then you layered into that the Industrial Revolution, which kind of made schools into more like mass factory line production. And Ken Robinson talks very eloquently about that. When you built on top of that, you know, getting people into the workplace, so there became a very strong emphasis on getting people into the workplace and getting people through the system. So the existing system has been designed very much like a factory, with batches and batches of young people, all the same age. They go through the system, bells ring, you're boxed in classrooms. It's very individualistic. It's very economically driven. This is not about developing the whole human being to live for the whole world. So schools are, and by the way, there's some fantastic work going on in schools around the world, don't get me wrong, but the system wasn't designed to empower people to create a better world in this kind of holistic way. And so I don't blame teachers or really anybody in the system. It's just a fact. The system isn't designed for that. So I think, to your question, you know, should schools lead with questions? I think that's a super starting point. I don't think it's enough, by the way, but it's a super starting point, because currently schools are driven by answers. You know, it's the teacher telling you that this is the curriculum, this is what you need to learn, memorize this, regurgitate it under examination conditions, and you can move on to the next stage of education. So the actual industrialization of the education system has itself driven people into this very standardized answer-based system, which is not serving our purposes as a species or as a planet. There are a lot of very interesting examples, and I'll just throw out a few that immediately come to mind. So if we accept that the aim of schools needs to be transformed to the development of the whole human being who is living for the whole world, if we can reduce it to that kind of idea, there are some fantastic examples. So Guy Etienne in Haiti, he started out as a school teacher, science teacher, in a school in Haiti, and he was thinking about this. You know, we need to empower young people. So he started taking these really little kids out into the community to try to solve real community problems. And this is a really common idea, that we need to empower young people from a very early age to actually be solving real world problems. It's deeply empowering for young people when they do this. He would take kids out and he'd say, you know, find a problem. So he's not telling them there's a problem. He's saying, you find a problem. And this classroom of kids, they said, oh, there's a big problem. The traffic lights are always broken. So can you help us to fix the traffic lights? So he started teaching them how electricity works and, you know, how to design and create this. And sure enough, they fixed these traffic lights in Port-au-Prince. And you can imagine these kids were thrilled, and he was thrilled, and it was all wonderful. But they came into school one morning and they found that someone had cut the electric cables and the traffic lights were broken. And the kids were really upset by this. You can imagine, again, you know, these kids, they've done all this work and someone's come along and destroyed our beautiful work. But what I love about the story is he said, no, the kids said, let's not give up. Let's try again. And what they ended up doing was they designed a solar system to power the traffic lights, which was too high for vandals to reach. So they implemented this in Port-au-Prince, and the model got replicated across Port-au-Prince. And you can imagine the impact on kids. That's an example of, within a school setting. Now, if you then sort of move out of a school, you've got someone, and by the way, there's some fantastic work. If you look at Agora schools in the Netherlands, Jan Vassen's doing fantastic work. Again, kind of ripping up the curriculum and saying, kids, you decide what problem you want to solve, and the teachers are there to help you solve that problem, and in the process learn really important life skills and qualities of being. So he's got a lovely model. But also in the Netherlands is Ima Beamer's work, who runs design-a-thons, and this is getting young people to use design thinking processes to solve global problems. And through that process, it's basically project-based learning, so it's interdisciplinary learning. It fits with national curriculum, or rather it supports national curricula. It's deeply empowering for young people, and they come up with all sorts of fascinating projects. So you can then start to see these interesting projects happening sort of within and starting to bleed outside of schools into the informal sector. There's beautiful work, Dream a Dream, in India, who are now part of the happiness curriculum implementation in New Delhi. And this is a huge program, which is now a program of young people who are contemplating happiness and well-being and quality of life and all of this stuff that we've been talking about earlier. And they're practicing it and learning about it and developing themselves. And then you've got people who are taking a really systemic approach. And they're saying it's not enough that schools are doing brilliant work. We also need the whole community involved in this work. So if I think of Catalina Koch in Medellin in Colombia, for example, so she started off doing work, working with young people, helping young people become peacemakers. So she had training programs, and she said she started getting, this was during the Civil War in Colombia, and then she started getting very frustrated because she wasn't reaching enough impact. She wasn't reaching enough young people. So she started training other people to train young people as peacemakers and built an organization. And then she started training multiple youth organizations to do the same work. So she was constantly stepping backwards. And now what she's doing, it's beautiful work, is she's bringing together schools, youth organizations, the ministry, businesses. She's bringing guerrilla factions who'd literally been killing each other not that long ago. And she's creating this process of connecting all of these people together in circles and really patiently and carefully curating deep conversations and very vulnerable conversations through which these people are finding peace between themselves. They're building trust between themselves, and they're finding a shared purpose. It's all about thriving together. And through this process now, which kind of spirals and rolls forwards, they're bringing more and more people in, and more people are starting to share good practices and ensure that everyone in their community is learning to thrive together. And this, I think, is just a beautiful model of weaving what I would call a learning ecosystem, or a whole community that is learning together to thrive together. Yeah, I mean, certainly the idea is definitely romantic. The practice is less romantic. There's a lot of sleeplessness and anxiety involved in making this happen. You need absolute patience. I mean, this takes real skill to do this. If you think about this practice, and we call it weaving. I first came across the word weaving in this context in the literature on collective impact. So if people aren't familiar with this, there's very strong evidence that complex problems, like the problem of changing education systems, require collective impact. You can't rely on individuals doing this alone. You can't rely on just individual projects separately creating change. You need to connect people and projects into a much more powerful force in order to effect complex system change, like the changing of education. And what's clear in all of the examples of effective, complex and collective impact approaches is that there is this practice of weaving at the heart of the process. The process is a process of weaving, and weaving is a really difficult and often stressful practice, and it involves broadly three things. The first thing is it involves continuously aligning the community to a shared purpose. Now, what that involves at a slightly lower level is you've got to make sure you've got the right people in your community, that you're engaging enough of the right people. And that means engaging people you might not agree with and you might not even like. So even there, before you've gone anywhere, you've got the stress of having to hold spaces within which there's often a lot of tension and often a lot of ego. And you've got to, through a process of deep conversation and careful sensing, you've got to encourage people to express their own vision, their own values, their own histories, and to find commonalities and to agree that we are moving, we want to move in the common direction, and we want to move in that direction in a common way. So there's something about aligning the values and vision in that work. It's difficult. But weaving's also about, not just about aligning people, but it's about helping people move from a shared purpose to sharing resources and sharing opportunities and sharing processes. It's about, in other words, fostering collaborations and co-creations, and that's often even more difficult.
We have an ego problem there, you know.
Exactly.
So
this is a massive problem. So weaving is the art of recognizing ego, helping people recognize their own ego, and helping people manage and soften their own ego. So everyone has an ego. Everyone resorts to ego when they feel threatened because they're confused or whatever that may be. So you've got this very difficult challenge in weaving, which is creating the conditions within which people can soften their ego in order to collaborate. But then, you know, collaborating is one thing, but you could be collaborating and just scratching the surface of a problem. You might not really be changing the system. So the weaver also has to say, we need to collaborate for deep systemic change. And that means we need to collaborate in the task of changing systemic mechanisms like policies, incentives, rules, regulations, etc., the kind of mechanistic aspects of a system. But equally, you need to be helping people collaborate to transform mindsets, because the education system is a human system. It's not a machine. It has mechanistic components, but it's the people in it who animate the system, and we have to change mindsets. That's the main thing. But then equally, weaving involves learning, because you have to transform the systemic mechanisms and mindsets in a way, not just one time, but continuously, because the conditions, the environment within which the education system exists is always changing. So the system has to keep adapting. If you think of the education system currently, it's been much the same for the last 200 or 300 or more years. It's got to become more adaptive, more flexible, more emergent. So weaving then involves aligning people, helping people collaborate for systemic impact, and learning together to continuously adapt together and to thrive together. And that's a really difficult task. But without that, we stand no chance, I think. Got to admit, there isn't a single how, and I certainly don't have visibility of all the hows. But
because it depends on the context as well, right?
It's often very contextual, yes. But I think for me, it's a great question, and for me, the starting point needs to be that we shouldn't wait to be told how to do this, or to be given tools that allow us to do this. We can just do this, because my learning is my learning. So in many ways, I think we can start this process without any permission and without any tools, because I am in my own system. I where I live in London, and I move around London. I move to different countries sometimes, and I'm learning all the time. So what I'm trying to do is to create my own learning ecosystem. So I'm taking ownership of the things I want to develop in myself, and I'm making efforts every day to do that. So I'm taking ownership.
But Ross, let me challenge you. So let's bring it to a lower level. Imagine that, I don't know if you're a parent actually, but
I am, yeah.
You're a parent. I'm a parent. Rui is a parent. And okay, I'm a parent. What can I do? Just give us some hints that what can I do as a parent to force or to increase this movement?
Okay, so as a parent, and I think this is connected again, Fred. So as a parent, I need to be on my own learning journey. I need to be learning how I can thrive, how I can help my kids thrive, how I can help society thrive, how I can help the planet thrive. That's a prerequisite in this model. So this is the starting point, needs to be yourself. The next question then, which you're asking, I think, is how can I help my kids become this kind of learner? So, and the shift I'm trying to emphasize here, it's not about teaching. This is about helping other people become learners through a process of you modeling yourself as this kind of learner. So it starts with me. I need to be continuously becoming this better person. And I need to be modeling, and through modeling this, I need to help other people. Now, there are other things I can do, though. So with my kids, I think it's really helpful to make sure that every day, and I try to do this every day, is to have one meal a day with the kids, where we'd sit down and we would talk. And it would be funny, and it would be stupid, and sometimes it would be, tense. You know what it's like as a parent. But essentially, I'd be trying to engage the kids in the idea that there's a big world out there, and there are some beautiful things happening, and there are some difficult things out there. And so I'm trying to instill a kind of inquisitiveness in my kids. When I'm out with my kids as a parent, if there's some litter on the street, I would make a point of picking the litter up. Demonstrate, and talking about, this is important. You pass someone who's homeless, and you'd start to ask questions. I wonder why they're homeless. I wonder how many homeless people there are. You can start asking questions around, I wonder, what the history of this factory is. Was there slavery involved in this factory at any point? So I think a lot of this comes from the kind of inquiry that you're able to prompt in young people, added to which the gift you can give to young people, which is to say, you decide, you take on instead of giving the answers, you figure it out, you decide, you go and do something. You're good at this. You can be good at that. Sure, art's beautiful, but why is it beautiful? And how can you make it more beautiful? And what kind of contribution would art make to the world? So a lot of this is very reliant on fixed techniques or tools. It's very much a kind of a relational quality of, it's about a quality of relationship with young people, I think. Honestly, don't really see it happening at a national level so much. I mean, there's very strong, these values are strongly evident in the Finnish system. In fact, most of the Scandinavian systems, for example. I think the values, the practice is not always quite as romantic, to use your word earlier. But the values are there. There are interesting projects. I was just reading a report from the Jacobs Foundation, who've been doing some interesting work in the Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, where there's a problem with a lot of young people involved in cocoa production and chocolate production. So it's child labor often.
Yeah.
And these kids are not in school, and it's problematic. And they're doing some very interesting multi-stakeholder work, bringing together industry with schools, with government, with social sector, and taking these kind of collective approaches to improving quality. I don't think the quality is quite there yet in terms of this whole person development. And then there are some schools around the world, again, taking very progressive approaches to involving community in them. There's some interesting initiatives that are bringing together libraries and museums and shopping malls and other actors into the learning space, so people are, new actors are involved. So, and then the other piece, which I think is potentially really interesting, is this sort of increasing movement around regenerative places. So bioregions. So this is not, it may be a city, but it may also be a kind of a bioregion where people are recognizing that they need to introduce a kind of regenerative agricultural practices, particularly. And they're also now starting to weave in learning into that. And now you're starting to attract property developers in. So people are saying we need to build new housing, but the housing needs to be highly sustainable. And so as well as regenerative farming practices, we want sustainable housing. And now we need to make sure that the schooling system is acting as a kind of a hub or catalyst for the whole community learning together. So kind of binding the whole thing together so that everyone in the community is learning to thrive together. Yeah, so I think, when I was talking earlier about becoming a certain kind of person, becoming someone who lives for universal well-being, that's my way of describing a change maker. Somebody who is equipped and inclined to make positive change in the world. And the skills of a change maker and the qualities of being of a change maker include those that I was describing earlier, plus those you just described. Someone who is empathic. So they're able to, and that's not just sort of feeling, that doesn't mean feeling sorry for everybody. It's not sympathy. It's about understanding other people emotionally and cognitively. And it's about being compassionate with other people. That's critical. And then, but as well as that, you need to have this sense of agency. You need to have this self-confidence and belief that you can actually make a difference. You need to be able to create a team and collaborate with others. That means leading a team or following, depending on the nature of the team and the problem. You need to have an intrinsic motivation to change things for the better. So you've got to be sensitive to the need for change. You need to be able to think systemically. You need to be able to be comfortable in complexity because the world is complex. You need to be able to communicate clearly. You need to be able, and that requires, again, more empathy and which is a form of curiosity, and it involves imagination, and that involves creativity. And that will all result in kindness and caring and ultimately thoughtfulness and wisdom, and that all requires self-awareness and self-regulation. So you need a whole bundle of things, but it's this type of person, this kind of person that Ashoka would call a change maker, other people would call things. This is the kind of person that not only I think we need in order to thrive together, but it's the kind of person that you need to become if you want to survive in the modern world. So you need to be this kind of person as an individual, and we need this kind of person collectively. Yeah, thanks for that challenge, Fred. I mean, the first thing I would say is that, if you look at the kind of political and social climate in Portugal now compared to the rest of the world, you are one of the most open-minded political and you have one of the most open-minded political and social cultures at this point, and I think that's absolutely critical. That it's please hold on to that, and please nurture that. I think that's absolutely vital that we have Portugal now. The invitation I would make, I think, is to say, is to recognize that across Portugal there are beautiful people doing beautiful things. And I know some of them, and I'm a long way from knowing all of them, but I know some of them. But I do imagine that these beautiful people doing beautiful things are not fully connected. This is what usually happens. We get so fixed on our own projects, and we're under so much pressure to survive, to bring in enough money. We want to make impact, etc., that it becomes very difficult for us to connect out. But my invitation would be is to pause, to look outwards, and to start to find those other beautiful people doing beautiful things. So if you're a beautiful person doing beautiful things, or if you want to be one of those beautiful people doing beautiful things, find other people and come together. And don't come together in a transactional way. Don't try to strike a deal. Just come together and get to know each other at a deep level. In the way you did at the beginning of this conversation, Fred, you asked me about where I've come from. Ask each other, where have you come from? So what's the deep values that you're holding? And what's this sense of direction that you've got? And are there ways in which we can align ourselves together in terms of aligning our narratives and projects? Is there a way in which we can collaborate even? Can we share resources? Can we share processes? Can we share opportunities? And can we learn together? Can we start to meet and talk regularly and learn together so that we're sharing good practices and changing ourselves together towards this thriving future? Now, if you can start to do that, that is the process by which you'll transform the system in Portugal, and that you will create this lighthouse of transformation that the rest of the world can look at and be inspired by.
Thank you, Ross, for this 1 hour journey and for helping us to understand this complex world of system change, and for giving us some clues of what is happening around the world with education, a topic that is in the core of our main concerns, just because we are human parents and responsible for the world we leave to other generations to come. And before we end, I still want to go back to Ross' inspiring quote from Alan Watts, and I repeat it: we are this universe, and we are creating it at every moment. Every day in junior achievement worldwide, we train, incentivize, and try to inspire young people to take their lives and the community's faith in their own hands, through discovering and improving their skills to do it in an altruistic, empathic, and efficient way. We also believe that people, nature, and the universe's final outcome totally depends on the actions we decide to move forward with our daily decisions. And that is the reason why we keep on embracing this mission of creating change makers who can be more and more focused on giving their talents in service of the well-being of everyone. Obrigado a todos e até já. Ross, I dare you to say in Portuguese, obrigado a todos.
Obrigado a todos.
Perfect.
Thanks so much, Fred, and thanks everyone for listening.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ross. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.